Welcome to today's webinar titled Linking Customer Experience to Financial Impact. I'm Jim Bass, Customer Experience Director at Macquarium, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Diane Majors, Strategic Advisor for Experience Management at Macquarium, is going to present today's topic. Brett Sharp, our Vice President of Customer Experience, is here too and will moderate the session. Together, Brett, Diane, and I are the Experience Management team here at Macquarium. Today's webinar is the first in our CX Navigator series. In our world of constant change, it's a continual challenge for brands to keep up with new and emerging technologies, as well as the heightened consumer expectations and demands. Macquarium's Navigator series is designed to help business leaders and practitioners maintain focus on the North Star of customer experience and connect the dots or navigate their businesses to that North Star. Each topic in the Navigator series will bring directional insight to strategy, as well as some specific how-to tactics to help companies navigate the internal and external obstacles to delivering a consistent, meaningful experience in line with their brand promise. After we present each topic in the Navigator series, we're going to send you a link to the webinar recording and worksheets or materials that we reference. We've chosen linking customer experience to financial impact as the first topic in the series because customer experience is more important now than ever before. Yet, we see some companies reducing or removing their customer experience investment while others are doubling down on it. Today, we want to give you tools, insights, and strategies which will help you connect the dots from your CX program to business results, as well as help you build your story and communications with your leaders and C-suite to secure your investment in CX. So with that, I'll turn it over to Diane to kick us off.
Well, thanks so much, Jim, and it's a pleasure to have all of you joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, and just to share a little bit about my own background on this topic. I really had to go and learn the approach of how to really tie financials to customer experience. In my work at Cisco Foods, because it was a supply chain logistics company, everything really needed to tie to the bottom line. And so it was, if I was going to get investment, I needed to be able to tell that business case story. So I'm going to share a case study today, but I'm also going to share some concepts and content that I think you'll find helpful as you continue on your journey to learn how to link this important part of customer experience as a discipline. So the first thing we're going to do is just talk about we're going to have a poll that will help us understand where you are in your challenges to connect experience to financial outcomes. So you should see on your screen a poll that's going to come up, and we've already kind of pre-populated some of those questions. Okay, it looks like I'm not sure how to tie CX to financial results. Well, that's good. That's why we're here. Leaders believe Net Promoter Score equals customer experience. Yep, we're going to talk specifically about how to marry NPS to the financial impact. Don't have the information necessary. We'll talk about how a few ways that you can approach that. And then this cross-team collaboration. So great answers, lots going on there, and not uncommon. When I've done this poll before, we get very, very common answers, very common themes. So let's jump right in then to, well, what do we do? So what stands in the way is not only all the things we just talked about, but also kind of this mindset and belief about customer experience. Customer experience is a nice to have, and they don't really, executives especially, don't really tie it to financial results. They don't really understand the financial impact of CX. There's sometimes stakeholder resistance where they don't think that you're after them helping achieve their goals. They might be overly focused on metrics. We talked a little bit about that with NPS. And you're also competing for prioritization and effort and investment. And then this last one about skills of CX leaders. Again, this is a muscle that you need to build. And so hopefully today we'll share some things that will actually get you further along in your own capability and competency. So let's just start with connecting these dots that Jim talked about, linking customer experience and, by the way, employee experience, partner and supplier, to financial results. So when we first start out and we really think about starting our CX journey or standing up a discipline in an organization, we create this strategy and program. But what I often find missing is the ability to build this CX value story. Then how do we deliver on that value? And then how do we integrate that thinking into the enterprise? So today, as we talk through this webinar, we're going to walk through 4 things. Talking about stakeholder assessment and how you understand and influence, talking about the critical KPIs that they're trying to accomplish. We're going to talk about value identification and an impact model. I want to give you a framework for how you might approach this with a project that you're actually doing today. We'll talk about the business case and the program ROI. And then we'll talk a little bit about the benefits realization. How do we tell that story and share what we've learned and what we've accomplished? So there's lots of research that supports CX value. You can see all over Harvard Business Review and through Temkin and other thought leaders, Forrester, CX leaders outgrow laggards over time. There's lots of statistics out there that really point us in the direction of, yes, this is something that we need. And I'm sure your leaders and executives are nodding their head when you say, of course we want to do customer experience. And yes, it's very important to us. But what they have a hard time understanding is, how do I achieve those goals that I see printed in all of these magazines or in publications? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to see, when they see experience-led brands outperform the market, like in this Watermark Consulting every year does a stock performance of leaders and laggards compared to the S&P 500. And what's important to realize here is that all your executives and leaders are seeing these type of statistics, and they're wondering, how come we're not getting there? Where are we seeing the results of our work? And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. We have to help them understand the how CX ties to financial value. And yet, when we think about what we do every day in our discipline, we don't connect it. Like, where is the financial value shown or addressed on a dashboard? Very, very rarely do we see, well, if this person is leaving and people are defecting, there's not a lot of dollars tied to that. So part of it is our own communication out about the financial value. I want you to think about any experience maps you may have generated. What financial value should be reflected there? Oftentimes, we find that there's nothing referred to as far as the impact of the experience to financial levers in the organization. We're going to talk specifically about that, and I'll show you an example later on in our webinar. So we have to expand our definition and use of value when we're having conversations with the organization. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's a great example. Oftentimes when I ask people to talk about customer experience and financial value, they have a hard time relating it to what's actually happening. So one way to do that is to ask people to tell you a story about an experience they've had. And often what happens is, when we think about our own experience or we hear those stories, it's all about what happened, our expectations that we had going into the experience, and what brands do every day. How they sell, the people they hire, how they market, how they price. Typically in those stories, you can think about, we typically say what happened, and then we follow that up immediately with how they felt. I was very frustrated about it, or I was really delighted that they did this. We as human beings often respond to our emotions. We're very much 85% irrational subconscious behavior. And so we think about how we feel drives behavior, and that's what drives business results. So when we start to talk to executives about why it's important to have a great experience, have them tell you a story, because they'll tell you a bad experience they've had, how they changed their behavior with the brand, and the impact. And all of a sudden, the light bulbs start to go on. By the way, we're not the only ones changing behavior. Marketing, sales, operations, service, everybody in the organization is trying to change that human behavior by looking at the response they have and changing what they do with the organization. So value is based on customer behavior. How churn, escalation rates, scores are based on it, customer lifetime value. Any measure or metric that you have in some way was a result of that customer's behavior. So understanding the behavior and the changes that are happening is where you start to see this tie to financial value. I'll give you an example of that. Connecting the dots. So experience means business financial value. Here's where we fall short again. We talk a lot about statistics, like 86% of customers will pay more for a special customer experience, or it's 5 times more expensive to acquire a new customer than retain an existing customer. Well, the disconnect there is it's great to see these statistics, but what if you were to translate that into financial impact for the organization? What if you looked at the cost of acquisition for your organization and the cost of retaining and said, hey, if it's 5 times more likely and we lose X number, we want to be able to start to tie financial value to these. So I always encourage practitioners to translate any statistic you see into how that could impact your organization. And I'll give you an example at the end. Here's another example of that. Now, you don't have to read all of this, just take a look at the one on the bottom right-hand corner. A bad experience costs money. After a bad experience with a company, 22% of consumers decreased their spending and 19% completely stopped doing business with the company. So translate that, if you will, into measurable financial impact. What is the reduced revenue, reduced customer lifetime value, and potential cost to serve that comes out of, if 19% of your customers walked out the door tomorrow, what would that mean in dollars? That's where you start to gather the attention of the executives and leaders, because they're seeing these statistics but aren't correlating it to what happens financially. So let me talk a little bit about that correlation versus causation. Correlation is a relationship between two things. Higher net promoter score equals to higher revenue. Nobody argues with that. There's been a lot of math that's been done, and you can do that math to say if we get a 1% increase or 1 point increase in net promoter score, it's X dollars in revenue. CX leaders grow faster than CX laggards. You can see here that there's a correlation, but not a causation. So I want you to start thinking about talking about cause, what you do in your program and what you do in your projects that drives financial impact that's based on change in customer behavior. For example, this CX project will directly impact revenue growth. The return on investment was achieved by changing experience and behavior. The measure was to reduce calls to care or subscription renewal. So we can start to say if we reduce calls to care, for example, we know that's a cause and it has an impact on financial results. So start to think about correlation and causation. Another way to think about this is let's think about the terms we use as practitioners. I want you to think a little bit about how you use these terms where you are, and I want you to see the correlation and causation effect when you see these 3 things together. One is experience measures. These are basically things you can count. I think about clicks to resolve, time to renew a contract, number of social media mentions, number of referrals, number of cancellations. So anything you can count. Then we talk about metrics. Metrics are an outcome. They reflect a perception of something. They are things like net promoter score, customer effort score, word of mouth score, brand index. Anything that's a score or index is a metric. Then we talk about experience value. This is the financial impact. This is cost to serve and acquire, revenue, share of wallet, customer lifetime value, retention. If you look at the column in the middle and the column on the right, metrics and value, those are typically correlations. But if you look at taking experience measures and making sure they track to experience value, you can quickly get to a business case. And so it's important to have a direction and a view of both of those things that are happening. How are you correlating, but are you also telling the causation story? Measures and metrics impact. I'll give you another example of that. Measures like increased reorder rate has a direct connection to measurable impact, to bottom line results and return on investment. Because if they're going to invest money to change something in one of your projects and you're going to increase the reorder rate, you can directly tie that to, we had an impact here and here's what the financial output. Versus I'm going to use a metric like increasing client satisfaction, which has a less direct connection. So they'll nod their head that, yeah, it's great to have happier customers, and we assume that they're going to change their behavior, but we can look at measures as a way to really know we changed behavior. Now, I'm not saying you can completely abandon metrics. They're very important, and you can get good directional information. I'm encouraging you to combine the two so we can tell a different story. Because what I typically see is we understand the customer's measures and metrics, and we have a lot of projects and initiatives in flight, but we don't often tell the story about the financial impact. Example of that. There was a customer experience team that worked for an automaker, and they had at the beginning a negative 29 net promoter score. Over a period of about 2 years, they put several projects in place, particularly around their service and care center. Things like better problem resolution, hold time, personal effort, listening, courtesy, automated use of phone. All of these projects they put in place were all calculated to say, we think we're going to move net promoter score a certain amount, and then they validated whether they did that or not. In the end, they had a net promoter of 70. So what do you think happened when they reached 70 net promoter score? The executives kind of said, well, you know what, we're done. Net promoter score is at a pretty good spot, and that's where usually the good companies are around 60, 70, 80. So I think we're done. What hadn't happened is they hadn't tied measures and business outcome to the projects that they were working on. So what that looks like is the ability to provide best help. There were reduced call center costs, reduced cost to serve, they reduced defection. All of those things have financial impact. So had they told that story, I think they would have been much better off. But there's one more part to the story. While they did all of these efforts and got better net promoter scores, they were actually leaking revenue from all of the activities that they had. So while net promoter score was up, they were actually financially in a worse place. That's why we have to tell both sides of the story. So expand your approach a little bit to other financial results. So here's another way to think about net promoter score. If you think about a likelihood to recommend, which is the question for net promoter score, I would ask you to yourself to think, well, do they actually recommend us? Do they refer us? How often? Can we drive more referrals? And what's the financial impact of that? And look outside to best practices and proven practices when you do that. By doing a little bit of research that you can see here from social media today, referred customers have a lower cost of acquisition, which means less marketing dollars. They have a longer retention and customer lifetime value, upwards of 16%. That's dollars. They spend more. That's revenue. They're less price sensitive. That's profitability. Their referred people are more likely to refer others. So lather, rinse, repeat, all of those great benefits that you just got. So this would be very simple to go back and look at how customers are finding you, and if they're coming through referrals, and compare them to the people who don't come through referrals, and show the difference and how that referral program, for example, that you're putting in place would have a financial impact. So that's a great way to also break down not just net promoter score, but really anything you're looking at, that customer behavior of how are they referring us, how often, and how can we drive more. So let's talk about how we change our story. If we have some concepts down and we have a little bit different view now and perspective of what's happening, what do we need to do to make a change? I would say one of the best things that I did when I was starting at Cisco and was struggling with this is go to each of the teams, go to the leaders and the teams themselves, and find out what they are most care about. What are their goals for the year? Financial goals, number of sales leads, revenue growth, earnings, retention, op cost, revenue growth, profitability. All of these terms that you hear, if we're coming back to them with here's our net promoter score, here's customer satisfaction, and we're not talking about helping them achieve their goals, we're not going to get good collaboration and buy-in. And in the example I'll give you in a little bit, we'll talk about how we went back to those groups and talk them through how we were helping them achieve their goals. So we need to really start talking their language. We need to turn CX speak into C-suite speak. My colleague Greg Tucker and I came up with this term because we realized that sometimes you get that blank stare when you're talking about net promoter score or anything else with customer experience. And what really started to resonate with them is when we started to tell the business case story. So you can see here on the side, we're talking about net promoter score and driver analysis and effort score. All great and wonderful, and we need that. But it's also then about helping to translate into things that they can go talk about that show we're decreasing costs, we're adding revenue, retention is improving, and it impacts our revenue growth. So be prepared when you go in to share not only the information you have around the customer behavior and the metrics, but talk about the measures and the financial value impact of that. So changing our story really looks like this. I have a program, initiative, project that will increase our revenue by A, reduce our cost base by B, drive an ROI within several months, and increase our net promoter score, effort, or customer satisfaction. It's a trajectory. It's looking at what you think is going to happen. Now, while you might not have every project have those three components, my point here is that we need to start talking in that language and marrying it to what we have in our CX metrics. So the executives will say, well, that's great, we're listening, can you prove it? And so this is where we'll talk about benefits realization. When we talk the value language, we can influence their perception of customer experience equals revenue, cost, and ROI. And this is how we can talk to them about it. We are also competing for investment. So not only do you have to be able to talk that language, but you're up against bringing your project in with everybody else who's coming to the table for money and talking about head of operations, for example. I have an initiative that's going to reduce our cost base by $5 million within 6 months. Or the head of sales who's going to hire some top performers to come in and predicts that they will get $3 million improvement against the extra cost. So these are powerful arguments we have to pitch against. So our language has to be in that same appropriate service to the organization and to the leadership so that they understand where we are. Okay, so now it's time for an example. So this is going to be a little bit detailed, but hang with me. I want to tell you the story. When we were at Cisco, we were having an opportunity with our request for proposals. Our win-loss ratio was not where we needed it to be. And we were getting feedback from the customers, prospects, and employees that the RFP process was not a lot of fun. And it was really wasting a lot of time. And it wasn't being as effective as we wanted it to. So we decided to go do a little bit of exploration in the marketplace with customers and employees and really talk through what was happening with the RFPs from the time somebody had a need to submitting it to us, what happened internally, how we got it back to the customer, the question and answer that went back and forth, and then how that converted or not to business. So we approached this a little bit differently and said, well, there's a lot of people who are involved. There's obviously the customer who's looking to achieve their own goals, but there's also the salesperson who is out working with these clients. There's the RFP coordinator, and there's all the business units that are contributing to that: pricing, operations, legal. Everybody has to weigh in on the RFPs. So we said, well, rather than just mapping the customer experience, why don't we map all the experiences? Because there's obviously financial impact for all of the information and effort that's going into this RFP. So what that looked like, while this is a boiled down version, is we said, all right, we're going to take the journey steps. Think about their goals, feelings. You guys, most of you have done journey mapping. But we really looked at also what is the impact, the financial impact of the experience to the customer. And then as we mapped also the employee's journey, all the employees who had anything to do with it, we also looked at where was the financial impact to the organization as a result of the experience the way it was, and what could be the financial impact if we were to change that experience. And so by identifying those levers that we could pull in financial terms, we were able to build a pretty strong business case. One of the things I would encourage you to do that you can start doing tomorrow is to include a financial impact journey swim lane in any experience mapping you're doing. What is the financial impact of the experience? And don't let people kind of get to the whole, satisfaction and a metric, but really hold their feet to the fire to say, what are all the things that are financial that we can rely on, including social media mentions and retention, all the things we talked about. And then we took all that information and we came back and we had design sessions with cross-functional teams, as well as the customers. We brought them in and said, you know what, if you help us design this, we can change things. And by the way, help you achieve your goals. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So we took this approach of saying, well, let's not talk about CX speak, let's talk about C-suite speak. And what we began to realize as we built this model was that we have a lot of projects where we're talking about we want to go do something. And we have these targets in place: improving employee experience, improving customer experience, optimizing knowledge management, optimizing our resources, making people more productive. But on the way on the other side was this increased revenue and reduced costs that the C-suite was thinking about. How are they thinking about return on investment? Because they knew it was a problem, but we were going to go back to them with a request for some money to go change things. And so we needed to talk about what their investment was going to get to them, just like any good financial manager. So we began to really identify first. We began to talk about, as we designed this, here's a list of some of the things that we decided to do as a part of this project. We reduced the number of knowledge management systems. We created a cross-team task force to build a knowledge base and keep it updated. Because, by the way, we knew that people, if you see down below, they're reducing information search time. People were searching on average an hour and a half per question for each of the departments to answer the RFPs. So they were just either trying to find something they'd done before or making it up as they went. So it was an impact of productivity. We conducted RFP reviews and cross-team working sessions. Rather than sending it out to everyone and getting it all back in and trying to compile it, we set specific activities around them. We optimized the cost and revenue models for the RFPs so that it was repeatable and quicker for us to build models. We had the RFP coordinator and salesperson work together so that it wasn't just a handoff, but they were really trying to make the RFP really address the customer's needs. So you can see these are just parts of the project that we put in place. So how we broke this down is we kind of took this big project and said, all right, what's the financial impact of this project to the organization? And by looking at each of the activities we were going to do, we were able to begin to tie that to some of the business levers that were very important to the business units and the general managers. Let me give you an example of that as I fill this in. I'm hoping you can read it. For example, when we redid the RFPs, our direct line of sight was to reducing the time to contract. So if we were able to get the RFP in and we didn't have to go through revisions, we could get this contract signed quicker. And we also improved our win ratio on RFPs. Both of those things are money in the bank. We also said we were taking credit for redirecting sales time, because we were letting the salespeople do more while we were working on the RFP instead of the salesperson handling it, which increased time to sell, which, by the way, increased customer acquisition or potential. We also then looked at the cost side of it. So remember, we found several knowledge management systems. When we consolidated them into one, we eliminated those systems. And guess who was really happy? The CIO, because we reduced the cost of ownership. We looked at redirecting that sales time and said, we're reducing sales cost with this RFP because we're more efficient. And then reducing the time spent on the RFP for each of the departments, we were able to increase the productivity of those workers who had spent a lot of their time working on an RFP when they should have been working on something else. This is just a sampling of how we broke that project down into these financial levers that we could then tie measures to go get baselines, and then tie the revenue dollars or potential cost savings so that we could go and tell the story about the investment they were going to make and what we anticipated they were going to get out of it. We then went and built the business case. Now, I'll encourage you and tell you this twice. I didn't have a background in finance. I couldn't build a business case to save my life. I started as a clinical psychologist, so it was not on my radar. But I went to work with the CFO and worked with the operations team to really understand how business cases got built, and then I had the CFO then start to understand, oh my gosh, customer experience really does equal financial impact. And he became a huge advocate. And guess who the CEO listens to? The CFO. So by getting them on board, I was able to start building business cases and dribble in how customer behavior should be included in this business case. So it was a double bonus because we were able to tell the story, but we also changed the internal process to include more about the customer and the behavior we were changing and the measures and metrics that we were using. So then we went back to the stakeholders because we talked to and they'd been engaged in this project, and we shared that business case benefits and the ROI estimates with them so that they could see this CX project was going to help them achieve their goals. And that got us great buy-in. It held them more accountable to it, and we were more successful because we had everybody's buy-in that we were going to help them achieve their own financial goals. But I also don't want you to forget about tracking benefits and value. So a lot of times we get investments for projects, and we'll go do the project and we might have one or two outcomes. Maybe it is Net Promoter Score or CSAT, but we don't actually track those business value benefits. We call this benefits realization, and it's a systematic part of the CX process. It's thinking about mapping those benefits, much like I showed you, looking at the impact assessments and targets, anticipating the benefits, identifying baselines so that we could say, well, here's where we started, and then we put the project in place for the investment and outcome milestones. And then what were the end outcomes and the benefit realization? By doing that, we began to really track the benefits from those baseline measures and the success criteria to how are we tracking in our trajectory to impact much as we had said in the beginning. Here's what we promised your investment was going to be. Here's what we said the outcome was going to be. Are we achieving that? And then we were able to actually deliver on that benefit and tell the story about how we achieved those goals. We had clear accountability and governance structure to make sure everybody was kept up to date with how we were doing on the project and what it was getting for the organization. So let's talk about just summarizing kind of this return on experience investment. If you think about all that you do, the actions that are taken to influence the experience, this is your projects and initiatives, impacts the human life. It's that emotion, it's what they do, it's how they interact with our brands. That drives the behavior change. And that behavior change is what impacts the financials, how revenue, cost, and profitability change based on experience. So it's going from action to impact that leads to the outcome. So this is where your cost of everything we do is the cost, and the benefit that we get out of all those things that we do is where your financial impact or ROI measures are. Okay, so let's talk about a summary and some action steps that you can take. And then I'm going to share some resources that we're going to send to you that will help you in building this story. I encourage you to go and create what if scenarios. Don't wait for a project to come along, or if you have a project underway, go create those what if scenarios. What if you were able to retain 1% of your base? Calculate that into financial outcomes and share that with your executives. Increasing customer lifetime value. Show them that this dependency on the customer's behavior really is what drives financial results by telling these stories and marrying these percentages to the outcomes. Partner with your CFO to quantify value. I can't encourage you enough to do this. It's important that you think about for all of the different teams like sales and revenue or customer acquisition or cost to serve, whatever the goal the organization is, there are levers that are measures and metrics that your CFO knows about and can help you start to trigger those and map those to what you're doing. You also need to bring the customer value story to life. So this is a future state storyboard session. But as I said, in your journey mapping, where is your financial potential, financial impact? You don't have to have it all boiled down at the very beginning, but you should be asking that, what's the impact to the financial stat of the organization of this experience? And then keep the stories human. We focus on stories and calculations, share the dependency of changing customer behavior. The numbers give us credibility, but the stories move people to action. And then think about this as your own personal and professional development. If you think about what great executives, how they become executives, it's often learning more about the organization, and it's being able to tell that financial story. And it's going to help you as a CX professional be able to tie customer experience equals financial impact. So building a value story is critical. We need to effectively lead transformation. We've got to communicate and deliver value. We need to command the C-suite and executive attention and focus initially and on a sustained basis. We got to make the program change a mission critical endeavor. That's why when Jim said at the beginning that some CX teams have been let go, it's because they didn't tie the importance of knowing about customers and the behavior that's changing, especially now, what the impact of the organization is going to be, but also how do we design to bring that behavior back the way that we want it. And we're competing for capital resources that are necessary to make the transformation. So you've got to tell the business story to get the investment from the executives. And we want to build it into changing the way business is done. Use existing things that exist, like the business case story I told you with the CFO, and add into it. Add the customer behavior to it. Add the levers that you need to pull and show that linkage to the two. So here's the resources I'm going to send to you. One of them is a value maturity model. So much like any other CX maturity model. Now, you don't have to read this now. We'll send it to you. But what I want you to do is when you identify kind of where you are on this model, I want you to put 5 or 6 action plans against how are you going to move from one stage to the next for each of these dimensions. Make it an action plan. The next thing I'm going to send to you is a connecting value to experience changes in your journey mapping. So here's a few swim lanes. If you think about a current project you have and the journey steps you're taking and the actions you're going to take, I want you to look and think about it from the customer's measure of success, from experience measures, experience metrics, the key performance indicators that your organization cares about, and the financial levers. So this is a practice for you to be able to take a current project and start to map those things together, connect the dots to what you're doing and how you're making change. And then I'm also going to send you this value impact map just so you can practice yourself, that you can actually take a project you're working on and thread it, break it down and thread it to this increased revenue and cost. So in wrap up, our key takeaways, it should be financial value is tied to changing behaviors and tying measures to dollars. We're extending and linking for a holistic additive business case. Much like what I shared with you and when we mapped all the journeys, we have to pull those things together and show upstream and downstream impact, but also top to bottom. Experiences drive financial impact. So we're ready for our Q&A, and I see we've got several questions that have come in. So Brett Sharp is on the call with us, and he is going to help facilitate some question and answer.
Thank you, Diane. This is a great thought-provoking session so far, so really appreciate it. Let's continue to go forward with answering a couple of the challenges that people are still dealing with. So I think one that we have several people challenged with is the idea of kind of what's the minimum level of CX measuring companies really need to have to start having an impact. So I think the example here is a lot of people are just doing, CSAT or NPS and not really doing it in necessarily a timely manner or, kind of incorporating it into the larger example. Maybe you want to talk about a couple examples and maybe show the maturity model in terms of the impacts there.
Absolutely. So I think you're right. And this, don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to build out a huge business case. But if you're thinking about satisfaction, well, satisfaction means you're looking for somebody to not only have a different emotion, like, be happier with their experience, but I bet somewhere along the way, you could link that to changing behavior. So an example of this would be we educated our salespeople on a needs-based segmentation. Now that simply says we don't treat everybody the same. We're going to do it based on what the customer needs are. And while we said, well, that's great, we have satisfaction, we also said, is that going to impact our revenue and how we bring money in? Is it also going to impact our cost to serve? I mean, if we're not sending out a salesperson when the customer is pretty self-sufficient and is really just looking for value add, then we don't. And so we've saved that cost. And I would also encourage you just to take, one measure tied to your metric and really start to kind of, as I said, show those two things married together so that people start to equate, hey, I have a customer CSAT, I also have reduced calls to the care center and reduced cost. So take it a baby step at a time. You can't possibly go in and build a big one at the beginning, but just getting people to talk that language, I think, is important. And I can go back to the maturity model.
Yeah, if you want to show that again and just maybe hold that up a little bit while we continue to talk, Diane, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely.
Yep. Another question there, kind of related, is what kind of experiences or differences between the measures do we really see in kind of B2B versus B2C? And especially in terms of not just the specific measures themselves, but is there consistency with how do we use the same approach, or how do we actually tie into showing that impact and getting kind of executive buy-in on the right measures?
Yeah, well, I'd say what I like about B2C. I'll talk about B2C for just a minute. It is important to think about what behavior we're looking for, because you know less about the customer. So there are certain things like number of people who walk into the store, number of people who purchase, number of people who, what's the check total, for example. So there are things that you can do in a B2C environment, which are somewhat easier to measure. But I would also think in the B2B space, what I love about it is that you actually know more about those customers. So the ability for you to look at things like adoption of your subscription by the sales team, for example, or the ability for them, like the RFP example I gave, what is their measure of success and how are you helping to achieve that? So I think it's just thinking about those a little differently and looking at what are they trying to accomplish and how do they define success? One of the best things that I was taught by another practitioner is you put yourself in the customer's shoes and say, what's on their scorecard about our brand? How are they judging us? And are we measuring those things and making sure that we know how they would gauge us? And do we have projects against what they're gauging? So it's not really drivers, it's really how they see us, what they want from us, and how they measure success. So that's a little bit different approach, but in the B2B space, it works really well because you do have that relationship and you'll know more than you would for a consumer, where we're kind of guessing sometimes who that consumer is and what their needs are.
That's great. And Jim Bass, I know you've had some good kind of B2B experiences there. Are there some additional experiences or a story you'd like to share on some of the value of the measures in B2B?
Sure. Thanks for asking. And I got to tell you that some of these slides here really got me excited, like the tying measures and metrics to business outcomes, and the turning the being able to do CX speak into C-suite speak. Those are really great for me. And that NPS slide, you guys know me and NPS, being able to show that type of measurement, growth, and tying it to those outcomes was one of my favorite slides in here. But to tie it to a story or some experience, really, tying those financials to the experience really gets attention of the leaders. So I'll give you an example. Back when I was at McKesson, we had a service issue that occurred about 500 times a year. And every time it occurred, it required service teams and support teams to work on it. It required escalation management. And no matter how many times this was brought up in surveys and up to senior leaders, we still never could get traction on getting the problem fixed until I realized and found out what the cost was each time. So each time that problem occurred, it was a $400 cost to the organization. So when you multiply out $400 times 500 occurrences a year, you come real quickly to $200,000. And that $200,000 was not just a one-time savings, that was an annual savings. And so once we were able to get their attention on this, not only were we saving money, but we're also saving that frustration. We were saving we're building customer confidence and trust. And then the leaders were coming at me with, what are some more problems like this we can solve? They all got excited about saving money and wanting to be able to report that upwards as well. So it was like, it created this snowball effect that really began to create a lot of synergy and a lot of focus on, CX is not just about a score of how happy someone is, but there's also dollars associated with it.
That's a fantastic story, Jim. I mean, it's a good case example of kind of seeing the bigger picture and being able to pull multiple pieces together to really tell that story. So thank you for that. We have another question that's kind of come in, Diane, that I think would be a good one. I think you talked about kind of some of the challenges of what's the incremental impact we could see. There's some questions around like what's the kind of the biggest impact or an expected impact that we could have by tying the measures into the financials. Do you have an example of what to expect?
Getting the money you need to go do your projects and create more value. I would say that when we started to talk about my story at the beginning, where it was, unless you could drop a penny to the bottom line, you weren't going to get any money. And so I had to be very specific about the activities we were going to do and what it was going to gain for the organization and track. And that really garnered us the ability for us to go have more successes, tell more of the value story, which really ingrained us in the organization. Because I think it's partly when you think about why customer experience fails, people get a lot of information and they get the scores or the metrics, but they don't really drive projects. They might have a few that are ongoing, but they're not telling the business value story. So I think it's self-preservation a little bit to be thinking about what this can do for you and how it can really change the perception the organization has of your discipline.
That's great. And in terms of kind of the results and the impacts of different programs, have you seen, are we talking, hey, there's been a great program, you can get 10%? Is there one that honestly, just by having, to Jim's example, right, maybe a 1 or 3% impact has huge financial impact for the company? Do you have kind of a baseline for that?
No, I think everybody's different. I'll be honest with you. And I always ask for each of the stakeholders. I always ask, what is most important to you? Because it may be something that is not expensive to do at all and has a huge impact, or they might be trying to achieve something that's really expensive to do and it's not going to get them very much value. So we can also really help thread and think about the thresholds and the level of effort and some of those other pieces that we don't really know what the outcome is going to be till we design it. So I don't think really any here on average, you should expect to get, 2% drop in call center. It depends on what you're trying to do. So I would say be very customized with how you think about the value and how you think about those levers you're going to pull and what's most important to customers and how it's going to be, the impact it's going to have later on.
I love that answer, and it's a nice, honest answer too, because the one thing that I always keep thinking about in my experience is I go back to the consultant 2x2, which is the level of effort, right, and kind of the impact that we're going to be able to have. And I think when you really put all your initiatives and the measures against that 2x2, it really says, are we really focused on the right things that are going to drive value to both the business and to the customers, and really back burner some of the stuff that isn't. So I love that idea.
Something else that you brought up that I don't want people to feel like all I'm talking about, it's all about the dollar, because I think there are a lot of intangibles that come with it. So I can think of examples where we've had, more employee engagement with something. But I would tell you that if you continue to ask the why question, or what's the financial impact of that, we can look at things like, great, we had an increase in employee engagement scores, but we also saw our retention go up and our cost to acquire go down when we did a referral program. So the more you ask the question, you can get the intangibles to in some way convert. Maybe it won't be, it'll be a little bit harder to track, but it's important to at least identify how those things thread together. Do you remember value mapping? From those of you who have done that before, that's what it is. It's kind of breaking down everything you're doing into where are all the value levers that I can pull.
Yeah, I love that. We have another one in terms of kind of which are the best metrics for best practices to link back to financials, NPS, customer effort, satisfaction. I'll just give kind of my perspective, but I'd love for you to jump on top of this, Diane. Is, I'd say none of the measures by themselves, in my opinion and experience, have been proven to withstand, be better and stand above everybody else. So I think it really depends on the metric that works for your organization, that everyone kind of can align around, and that you can actually, again, bring in some of those other pieces, some of the other measures, some of the other business impacts to really kind of drive that forward. Diane, what's your take on that?
I like to think about it like in a football game, you have the score up on the scoreboard, right? That's kind of, what's happening and what's the outcome been from that bench. But I would also tell you to think about what it took to get there. All the things that had to come together to make that score are the things that need to be paid attention to. If they fumble the ball, if they get a lot of flags thrown at them, those are the things you need to pay attention to, because that impacts the score. So it's more about paying attention to the game and what's going on than the score itself. While the score is important, it's not going to be okay, what do we go do about it? The going and doing about it and finding the real value is going to be what you do to look at what's happening on the football field, for example. So yeah, I always kind of see it that way. So Yeah, so you kind of know these are the things I can influence, the things happening on the football field, which eventually impact the score, but it's not going to be a one-to-one directly. And that's the other caveat I would say, is that it takes a while when you make a change for that to show up in Net Promoter Score, because you have to have several good experiences. You've got to kind of change your perception and the outcome. So it's not as immediate as saying we reduced by changing a piece of content on the website, for example. We reduced calls to the care center, and that reduced our cost to serve. You know, you can go from there. So I like talking about the measures and value because they are tangible in the moment. You can see immediate results, which is when I started the story about making sure at Cisco you could tell that story. I started really small and I just started to glean in. I didn't talk about, you know, the scores. I just talked about changing the behavior, which changes the outcome, which is married to the financial impact.
Yeah, and every place I've been where I've really been able to make a big difference in that, it's really been, I think, to Marco's point that he brings up in the chat, which is the idea of a portfolio of measures and metrics that are really diagnostic and tie back to levers within the business. Because then you're able to look at each one of those and say, hey, there's a lot of things that are happening at different play. Some will go and play together and some will be at odds with one another. And by having that portfolio of measures and metrics, you're able to really kind of narrow in on kind of what's really having the biggest impact and when. So with that, Diane, thank you very much for this. Do you want to kind of wrap up? And Jim, I think this has been a great session. Thank you all. And thanks for all the questions.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Brett, and all the great questions from our audience as well. So thank you guys for the engagement. We hope that you're able to take away a few ideas that you can act on this week. And just as a reminder, after we present each topic in the Navigator series, we're going to send you a link to the webinar recording, as well as the worksheets or the maturity model, et cetera, that Diane mentioned earlier. We're going to send you a link to those as well. So be on the lookout for an email message from us in a few days that'll have those hyperlinks. Also, our next webinar is going to be on Thursday, July 16th at 2:30 p.m. The topic is going to be how to use design thinking to drive change. So we'll hope you'll join us again and hope you have a great week.